Welcome to the ESDoc screencast about our documentation for the CMIP6 MIPs and their experiments. The experiment documentation describes the motivation for the experiments and formalises the requirements for models running them. You can find out about how we built the database of experiment documents on our experiment page, and you can view the database via the published documentation link. We see here a list of CMIP6 documentation for each of the MIPs. As an example, let's take a look at DAMIP, the Detection, Attribution, Model Intercomparison project. Our documentation starts with some high-level information about this MIP. There's a description and some information about why this MIP is important, the rationale. We also see a list of all the experiments that are defined by this MIP. They're listed by tier, Tier 1 being their highest priority. Finally, there's a list of experiments that are required by this MIP, but are not themselves governed by the MIP. In this case, the pre-industrial control, the historical, and the SSP2 4.5 scenario. In addition, there are citations that tell you information about this MIP, and there's also contact information for the principal investigators. So let's take a look at one of the DAMIP experiments. HistNat. HistNat is a historical experiment with natural-only forcing. Just like the MIP documentation, this experiment begins with high-level information that includes a description and a rationale. We also provide context for this experiment in terms of its relationship to the other experiments within CMIP6. We then see a list of each of the requirements of the experiment. These begin with a temporal constraint, with information about how long the simulations need to run, in this case for 171 years, from the beginning of 1850 till the 1st of January in 2021. There's an ensemble requirement, with information about how many simulations are needed for this experiment, and also information about the model configuration. What follows are a list of the forcing constraints for this experiment. Given that the simulations for this experiment begin in 1850 and end in 2021, so the natural forcing requires both historical and future elements for the volcanic and solar forcing. As well as this solar forcing and volcanic forcing, the experiment also requires that greenhouse gas forcing be set to pre-industrial levels, as is tropospheric forcing from aerosols, and also land use. We use these forcing constraints as a framework to collect information from the modelling groups about what they did to their models to conform to the demands of each of these requirements. Finally, there are citations. These provide background information about the design of the experiment and also information about forcing datasets. Finally, there's a list of responsible parties. That is, the people who designed the experiment. If you find you have any queries whilst you're viewing our documentation, you can navigate back to the ESDoc web pages from the ESDoc logo at the top of the page. From there, it's just a simple step to our contact page, where you'll find our support email address.